Rosa Ellis, a quiet, elderly janitor, stepped into the courtroom, but she wasn't just there to clean. She had a secret mission, to expose a powerful white judge who had turned justice into a weapon of prejudice. For years, his courtroom had been a stage where the verdict was decided before the trial even began. But can one ordinary woman take on a system designed to silence voices like hers? What if the truth was right in front of you, but no one wanted to see it? As Rosa picks up her mop, she isn't just wiping floors, she's gathering evidence. And what she uncovers will shake the foundations of power. Before we dive into this incredible story, subscribe to 30 Minds and hit the bell icon for more stories that uncover hidden realities. Will justice finally be served, or will the system bury the truth once again? So let's begin. The sun was just beginning to stretch across the rooftops of a quiet Georgia town, casting long shadows over the cracked sidewalk and faded awnings of Main Street. The courthouse clock hadn't yet struck 7, but inside a modest motel room, just a few blocks away, Rosa Ellis was already wide awake. The room was bare, just one suitcase by the door, a folded uniform on a chair, and a phone held tightly in Rosa's hand. She stood near the window looking out at the stillness. Her face was calm, unreadable, the kind of face that had learned through years of experience not to reveal too much. But her eyes held focus, sharp and steady. She took a breath, then spoke into the phone. "Yes," she said, "I've read the full report. The patterns are consistent, and the complaints are credible. I'll go in today just as planned. No names, no attention, just observation." A pause, then her tone shifted, cool, decisive. "I'll see it for myself. Today's hearing will tell us everything we need to know about Judge Carter." There was another pause on the line. Rosa listened, then gave a small nod. "Don't worry, I've done this before. They won't even notice I'm there." She ended the call quietly, like someone closing a door they didn't plan to reopen. She placed the phone in a small zippered pouch inside her bag, then turned to the chair. Her uniform was already laid out, plain navy blue with a simple patch sewn on the chest that read, "Facilities." It was a janitor's uniform, the kind people walked past without looking twice. But the woman putting it on, she wasn't what she seemed. Rosa zipped up the front, smoothed out the sleeves, and stepped into her black work shoes. She glanced briefly in the mirror. What she saw wasn't weakness, it was purpose, strength without noise, power without ego. She opened her suitcase and removed 2 items, a worn notebook and an old ID badge, both tucked safely into the inner lining of her bag. She wouldn't need the badge today, hopefully. With a quiet breath, she slung her bag over one shoulder, grabbed her mop handle, and walked out of the room. The courthouse stood tall, a pale stone building with columns like old bones. It had stood for over a century, but the stories that passed through its walls weren't all honorable. Rosa had studied its history. She knew its secrets better than most. She entered through the staff entrance in the back, nodding politely at the security guard who barely glanced up from his phone. "Morning, Miss Rose," he mumbled. "Morning, Mike," she said softly. Inside, the building smelled of lemon cleaner and paper files. The floor tiles echoed under her shoes as she made her way to courtroom 3B, the site of today's hearing. Her cart rolled behind her with a soft creak. People were already gathering, lawyers flipping through briefs, a nervous young woman in a blazer whispered to a colleague, a bailiff leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching everything and nothing. But the center of the room, the bench where Judge Carter would soon sit, felt different, heavy, like a storm cloud had settled above it. Rosa took her place near the rear of the courtroom, next to a supply closet. She opened her notebook, made a quick note, and tucked it back into her bag. No one noticed. The defendant, a young black man, maybe early 20s, sat alone at the defense table, hands clasped, eyes focused on a spot on the floor. The tension around him was thick, as if everyone had already made up their mind. Rosa watched him closely. There was fear in his posture, but also dignity, like he was used to fighting for space in a world that rarely offered it. Then she looked toward the bench again. She knew Judge Carter's history, the way he dismissed complaints, the way he ruled in favor of authority even when the facts begged otherwise. She knew the stories, the statistics, the patterns, but stories were not enough. Rosa was here for the truth, seen with her own eyes, heard with her own ears, because some things you have to witness for yourself. She leaned slightly on her mop handle. To everyone else, she was just another cleaner in the background, but Rosa Ellis was never just in the background. She was watching, waiting, and this time, justice was watching with her. The courtroom doors creaked open as Judge James Carter entered. He didn't speak, he didn't have to. The entire room stood as if on cue. The bailiff called out the formalities, but all eyes were already on Carter. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way a man walks when he believes the world belongs to him. Tall, clean-shaven, hair neatly parted to the side, his robe flowed behind him like a shadow. But it wasn't his appearance that made people nervous, it was his reputation. James Carter had been a judge in this county for over 20 years. Folks around here said he was tough but fair, but not everyone agreed with that second part, especially if you were black, or poor, or dared to speak up in his courtroom. He had a long history of shutting down defense attorneys, especially young ones. He cut off witnesses mid-sentence, and when it came to cases involving black defendants, well, let's just say the statistics weren't on the side of fairness. Today's case was no exception. Seated at the defense table was a young black man, Janitor Thomas, 22 years old, arrested for allegedly stealing a watch from a downtown jewelry store, and assaulting the store clerk. But the surveillance footage was blurry, the eyewitness had changed her statement twice, the clerk was a friend of the judge's golf buddy. Still, here they were, prosecutors were pushing for 5 years. The courtroom murmured as the case file was passed around. The air felt dense, like truth was trying to speak but kept getting interrupted. Carter looked over his glasses, scanned the room, then fixed his gaze on Jan. "Mr. Thomas," he said, his tone sharp as a knife, "this court doesn't take kindly to criminals who think they can play games with the system. No mention of alleged, no presumption of innocence, just judgment served cold and early." Jan sat stiff, his hands folded in his lap. His lawyer, Marcus Reed, a young public defender not long out of law school, looked visibly tense. Rosa, meanwhile, had positioned herself near the corner, mop bucket beside her, rag in hand. She moved slowly, deliberately, like someone who knew how to disappear in plain sight. She dusted a bench here, wiped a window there, but never took her eyes off Carter. Her gaze wasn't obvious, but it was focused, watching the way he leaned forward when the prosecutor spoke, watching how his face tightened at every word Marcus tried to say in defense. She made a quick note in her small notebook, hidden behind her cleaning cart. Carter glanced once, briefly, in her direction, but like most people, he didn't really see her, not as a threat, just another invisible figure in the background doing background things. And Rosa let him believe that. As the prosecutor laid out the so-called evidence, Rosa's attention never wavered. She noted the inconsistencies, the way the witness hesitated, the way Carter dismissed objections from the defense with a wave of his hand, like he'd already made up his mind. Something deep in Rosa's chest tightened. This wasn't a courtroom, not really. It was theater, and the ending had already been written. But Rosa wasn't here to applaud, she was here to change the script. It was during a short recess that Rosa found herself standing in a quiet hallway behind the courtroom. She had taken her mop cart down the corridor that led to the judge's chambers, where the tile floor was scuffed and the air smelled faintly of old wood and lemon polish. She was wiping a stubborn streak off the baseboard when she heard voices. 2 men, one of them unmistakably was Judge Carter. His voice carried with the casual confidence of someone who'd forgotten they could be overheard. "These kids," he said with a dry laugh, "they think they can walk in here, cry, race, and get away with it. Back in my day, they wouldn't dare talk back to a judge." The second voice belonged to a man Rosa recognized from earlier that morning, District Attorney Henry Blake. He chuckled in response. "Well, your courtroom still runs like it used to, James. That's what folks appreciate. You don't let politics cloud your judgment. Damn right I don't, Carter replied, especially not when some mouthy public defender wants to waste my time defending street trash. That kid out there, he's no different than the last one, same attitude, same lies. Rosa froze, cloth still in her hand. There it was, not innuendo, not speculation, not bias wrapped in polite language. This was raw, unfiltered contempt, spoken with comfort, with pride. She didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. You know, Blake added, if that janitor lady out there heard us, we'd be in trouble. Carter scoffed. Please, who's she going to tell? She probably doesn't even understand what we're saying. A long pause, and that's when Carter stepped out of his office. Rosa had just started wiping the wall again, trying to look absorbed in her work, but it was too late. He stopped, his eyes narrowed as they landed on her. How long have you been standing there? He asked, voice cold and tight. Rosa turned to face him, her expression calm. Just cleaning, sir, that's all. But she didn't flinch. Her eyes met his and held. Carter stepped closer, lowering his voice. Let me be clear, what you think you heard, you didn't. And if you open your mouth to anyone about anything, you'll regret it. He leaned in, his words low and venomous. You think people like you matter in this building? You don't. You're invisible, so stay in your lane. The hallway was still. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly. Rosa said nothing for a long moment, then without breaking eye contact, she slowly folded her cleaning cloth, placed it neatly on top of her cart, and straightened up. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but there was steel in it. Funny thing about people you call invisible, Judge, they tend to see everything. Carter blinked, just once, not enough for most people to notice, but Rosa noticed. She picked up her mop handle and turned away without another word, pushing her cart down the hallway as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed, because now Rosa knew without a doubt that what she came here to find wasn't just rumor, it wasn't just suspicion, it was truth, and the man behind the bench, he wasn't just biased, he was dangerous. Back inside the courtroom, the next phase of the trial was about to begin. Carter re-entered from the side door a few minutes later, composed as ever, but Rosa watched him closely. His stride was just a touch stiffer, his smile a little too forced. He had seen her, really seen her, and for the first time in a very long time, that made him nervous. Later that afternoon, after hours of back-and-forth testimony, the courtroom had begun to empty for the lunch break. Rosa moved quietly through the aisles, wiping down the wooden benches where spectators had sat shoulder to shoulder just an hour ago. The echoes of heated argument still seemed to linger in the air. She reached the front of the room near the judge's bench and glanced quickly around. No one was watching. From the side pocket of her cleaning cart, she pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound notebook. It wasn't anything fancy, just black with creases along the spine and a small elastic strap to hold it closed. It looked like something a housekeeper might carry to jot down cleaning schedules or supply lists. But inside were names, dates, patterns, notes on rulings, behavior, tone, observations she'd gathered over weeks, months even, not just about this courthouse, but others like it, judges like Carter, patterns no one wanted to admit existed. Rosa had been tracking them for years. She opened to a blank page and began writing quickly, almost rhythmically, her pen gliding across the page with practiced ease. She was halfway through a sentence when she felt a shadow fall across the bench. She didn't look up right away, but she didn't have to. She could feel the tension in the air change. What are you writing? The voice was sharp, flat, cold, Judge Carter. Rosa glanced up. He was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, looking down at her with that same blend of authority and suspicion he reserved for people he considered beneath him. She closed the notebook slowly, calmly. Just a few personal notes, sir, she replied. Her voice was steady, polite, but her eyes, those quiet, calculating eyes, never wavered. Carter narrowed his gaze. Notes about what exactly? Your mop technique. There was a flicker of amusement behind his words, but his face stayed hard. Rosa smiled faintly. Nothing that would interest you, Your Honor. That answer, too smooth, too quick, made something shift in Carter's expression. He stepped closer, and for a moment Rosa could see it, the flicker of uncertainty behind his eyes, not fear, not yet, but the beginning of it. You're not here to clean, you're here to take notes, he said, his voice dropping. You're here to clean, so do that. There was a long pause between them. The room was empty, but the silence felt loud. Rosa calmly placed the notebook back into her pocket, folded her rag over the edge of her cart, and faced him squarely. Of course, sir. I know my role. Something in her tone made him flinch. He didn't know why, but he didn't like it. He straightened his posture, pulling himself back into the persona of power. Just remember, he said, tone clipped, this is my courtroom. You don't want to make yourself a problem. Rosa didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any threat. She turned and rolled her cart toward the hallway without another word. But behind her, Carter watched her go, his jaw clenched just a little too tight, his eyes lingering too long on the pocket where the notebook had disappeared. For the first time, he realized something he hadn't considered before. She was watching him, and whatever she was writing in that little black book, it wasn't about cleaning supplies. Outside in the hallway, Rosa paused near the vending machines. She opened her notebook again, drew a small line beside the name James Carter, and added a new note beneath it, confrontational, defensive, shows early signs of panic. She tucked the notebook back into her cart, then walked away slowly, calm, measured, invisible once more. But in her mind, the case was no longer just about the young man on trial, it was about something bigger now, much bigger. And Rosa Ellis was no longer just observing, she was building a case of her own. The courthouse break room was never particularly warm, but today it felt colder than usual. Fluorescent lights buzzed above faded linoleum. The coffee machine sputtered in the corner, filling the air with the bitter smell of something brewed too long. Rosa stood by the sink, slowly rinsing her hands, when Anna Jenkins stepped in, holding her usual chipped mug a bit more tightly than normal. Anna had been the court's senior clerk for nearly 3 decades. She had seen things, heard things, endured things. She was the kind of woman who had grown used to swallowing frustration without letting it show, but today it leaked through, in the way her mouth tightened, the way she stirred her coffee like it had done something wrong. Without turning, Anna muttered something about the judge, about the way he'd shut down the defense that morning, like he wasn't even pretending to listen. Rosa didn't reply right away. She kept drying her hands, folded the towel neatly, and placed it back in the bin. Then, softly, almost as if speaking to herself, she said, "Sometimes the law is loud, but justice whispers." Anna looked up, puzzled. Rosa offered a small smile, but said nothing more, just that. And it was enough for Anna to pause, enough to plant a seed of curiosity she hadn't expected to feel. That was the thing about Rosa, she didn't say much, but when she did, it stayed with you. A little later, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Rosa crossed paths with Marcus Reed. The young public defender looked like he hadn't slept in days, papers clutched in his hand, tie slightly loosened, frustration etched into the lines of his brow. He passed Rosa without a word, but then paused, glanced at her. Something about the way she stood, leaning against her mop handle with quiet confidence, made him speak, just a short vent about the judge, the case, the way it all felt stacked against him. Rosa listened, not with sympathy, but with something deeper, like she understood too much to simply nod. Then, without thinking, she offered a single observation about a federal ruling, one not often cited in cases like this. Her tone was casual, almost dismissive, like she was merely talking about the weather. Marcus blinked, caught off guard, but before he could ask anything, Rosa had already pushed her cart forward, disappearing into the hallway's curve like a shadow that had never been there. That evening, as the building began to settle into its late afternoon hush, the memory of those two interactions lingered, subtle but undeniable. Anna couldn't stop thinking about that sentence, "Justice whispers." Marcus found himself flipping through his notes later and, almost by accident, typed the ruling Rosa had mentioned into his search bar. And there it was, just as she'd said, relevant, precise. Neither of them knew who Rosa Ellis really was, but they both began to suspect she wasn't just there to clean. And somewhere deep inside that quiet courthouse, filled with old walls and older habits, the wind had started to shift, just a little, but enough. The afternoon sun cast long slants of light across the courtroom floor, catching particles of dust that danced slowly in the still air. Courtroom 3B had gone silent, save for the occasional shuffle of papers and the distant ticking of the wall clock. It was the kind of silence that didn't come from peace, but pressure. Jalen Thomas sat at the defense table, shoulders tight, eyes focused downward. His suit jacket, borrowed and slightly oversized, hung stiffly on his frame. Every time he looked up, it was like he was bracing for impact. Across the room, Marcus Reed stood behind the defense podium, flustered, under fire. He had tried everything, pointed to the inconsistencies in the testimony, raised questions about the lack of forensic evidence, even highlighted the surveillance footage that clearly showed a figure who didn't match Jalen's height or build. But none of it seemed to matter. Judge Carter slouched slightly in his chair, looked unimpressed, detached, at times outright irritated. He cut Marcus off mid-sentence, sustained objections before they were even finished, and leaned forward only when the prosecution spoke, as if they were the only voices worth hearing. From the bench, his words dropped like stones. "Counselor, if your strategy is to waste the court's time, you're succeeding." Marcus swallowed hard, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He knew better than to push, not here, not with this judge. A wave of quiet discouragement rippled across the courtroom. Even the few people in the gallery, mostly family members, a handful of community advocates, began to sense it, the shape of the outcome already forming like a storm cloud overhead. Behind them all, unnoticed as always, Rosa stood in the corner near the exit, her mop leaned against the wall, forgotten. She wasn't pretending to clean anymore. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, stayed locked on the judge, not in defiance, not even in judgment, but in absolute silent assessment, like someone watching a machine malfunction in slow motion, waiting for the precise moment to step in. Her hands were steady, her stance firm, but something had shifted. This wasn't just observation anymore, this was decision. Carter turned to Jalen, a hint of finality in his tone, the edges of his voice tightening like he was preparing to bring the gavel down, figuratively if not yet literally. He spoke not to ask, but to instruct, not to question, but to declare. And Rosa knew, she knew the verdict had already been written long before Jalen walked into that room, written in the quiet glances, the dismissive tone, the refusal to consider evidence that didn't match the narrative Judge Carter had already chosen. Justice wasn't being served, it was being staged, and Rosa Ellis had seen enough. She reached slowly toward her cart, not for a mop, but for something else, something far more powerful than bleach and rags. Her mind was made up. The next move would be hers. The air in the courtroom had grown thick, so heavy it seemed to press down on every shoulder in the room. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, eyes half-lidded, tapping his pen slowly against the wood. Based on the testimony and available evidence, he began, this court is prepared to. Then came a voice, calm, clear, unmistakable, Your Honor, I have something to say. The words didn't shout, they didn't need to. The entire room turned toward the back. Rosa Ellis stepped forward, not rushed, not hesitant, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had made peace with the weight of truth. She left her mop behind, her cleaning gloves tucked into her cart. She no longer wore the uniform of invisibility. Carter stared at her, momentarily confused, then came the smirk. You, he scoffed. The janitor? What could you possibly have to say that matters in a court of law? He let the words hang in the air like a slap, but Rosa didn't flinch. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a leather badge holder, and flipped it open smoothly, silently. The room held its breath. The seal was unmistakable, United States Supreme Court. The silence cracked like ice beneath a boot. Gasps spread like wildfire through the courtroom. Even the bailiff blinked, as if he weren't sure whether to step forward or step back. "My name is Rosa Ellis," she said, her voice steady but strong, "Associate Justice. I've served on the United States Supreme Court for 13 years. I came here undercover at the request of the Department of Justice following multiple civil rights complaints tied to this courtroom and this judge." Carter paled, his lips parted but no words came out. Rosa took another step forward, her tone now cutting through the room like a scalpel. "Over the past several weeks, I've observed a consistent pattern of bias, abuse of authority, and disregard for due process, especially when it involves defendants of color. What I've seen here today only confirms it." She scanned the room slowly, every eye locked on her. The quiet woman with the mop was gone. In her place stood someone who held the very weight of justice in her palm. And for the first time in that courtroom, Carter looked small, not because of his stature, but because the truth had finally taken form, and it wasn't loud or angry, it was Rosa, and she was undeniable. The room remained frozen, held in place by something heavier than shock. It wasn't just that Rosa Ellis had revealed herself, it was what she represented, truth stepping out from the shadows. She stood in the center of courtroom 3B, her voice clear and unflinching. "Let the record show," she began, "that Judge James Carter has, over the course of multiple proceedings, demonstrated consistent judicial misconduct in the form of racial bias, disregard for legal precedent, and active suppression of defense counsel. No dramatics, no theatrics, just facts." She held a slim folder in her hands, every page marked and color-coded. She opened it, eyes scanning with the ease of someone who had spent decades in the law, not above it, not beyond it, but inside it. In the last 6 months alone, Judge Carter resided over 27 criminal cases involving Black or Latino defendants. In 26 of those, he ruled in favor of the prosecution, even in cases where evidence was insufficient or contradictory. A murmur spread through the courtroom like a ripple across glass. Carter shifted in his seat, a deep frown cutting across his face. "That's circumstantial," he said tightly, "you're cherry-picking." But Rosa didn't flinch. "It's not cherry-picking, Judge, it's documentation," she continued, her voice gaining quiet force. "I've reviewed your rulings, objections dismissed without basis, defense arguments cut short. I've watched your body language, how you lean forward when the prosecution speaks, and how you interrupt when a young defense lawyer tries to be heard. This isn't an accident, it's a pattern." Carter stood now, sudden and defensive. "This is a political ambush," he barked. "A setup brought on by liberal watchdogs and race hustlers who want to undermine the integrity of this court." The room stiffened. Even the court reporter paused, unsure if she should keep typing. Rosa, still composed, gently closed the folder and looked at him, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous to a man like Carter, certainty. "No, James, this isn't politics, it's accountability, and it's long overdue." Her words sliced through the courtroom like clean steel. She turned to the clerk's table and placed the folder down with deliberate calm. "A formal report will be submitted to the Judicial Oversight Committee effective immediately. I'm requesting a full review of all rulings issued by Judge Carter in the past 12 months. Carter's face went pale. He sat back down heavily, his breath shallow, like the room had lost its air. "Additionally," Rosa continued, "a retroactive audit will be conducted on every case over which you've presided in the last 5 years, jury selections, sentencing decisions, suppressed evidence. You've operated in the shadows long enough." He didn't respond, couldn't for a moment. Rosa paused. Her gaze turned not toward Carter now, but toward Jalen, the young man still seated at the defense table, still quiet, still waiting. His eyes were wide, confused but hopeful. Rosa let her breath settle. That was why she came, not for the headlines, not for the applause, but for him and the hundreds like him who never had a voice loud enough to rise above a gavel. She looked back at the courtroom. The weight of decades rested on her shoulders, but she wore it without complaint, because truth, once spoken, never truly goes unheard again. And today, it had finally been spoken. The courtroom was still, not out of shock this time, but reverence. Moments earlier, Judge Carter had been escorted quietly from the bench, his robe hanging slightly off one shoulder, his steps unsure, like a man walking off a cliff he never believed was real. The gavel had not fallen. There was no final bang, because sometimes justice doesn't shout, it simply shifts. Marcus Reed stood beside Jalen Thomas, who still looked as if he couldn't quite breathe. His lips moved, but no words came out, not yet. The clerk read the new verdict aloud, voice trembling slightly from the emotion in the room. Case dismissed, charges dropped, the defendant is free to go. For a second there was only silence, and then quietly, people began to rise, not in celebration, but in relief, in recognition, the kind that doesn't come with applause, but with stillness. Heads nodded, hands touched, hearts ached. Jalen turned to Rosa, eyes wet. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. His expression carried it all, gratitude, disbelief, hope. She gave him a small nod, as if to say, you were never invisible to me. And then Rosa turned. She picked up her coat, draped it over her arm, and walked toward the exit slowly, deliberately. The mop cart remained behind in the corner, no longer needed. People stepped aside as she passed, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. Their eyes followed her, not just with respect, but with something deeper, understanding, the kind that only comes after witnessing truth, not on paper, but in motion. As she reached the doorway, someone called out softly from the gallery, "Ma'am, do you have anything to say?" Rosa paused, turned slightly. Her voice, calm and grounded, cut through the hush one final time. Justice cannot survive where prejudice rules the heart of the one holding the scale. But the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way to the light. Then she stepped out into the sunlight. Outside, the air was crisp. The sun had begun to sink low, casting long golden streaks across the courthouse steps. Rosa paused at the top, breathing in deeply, not as a victor, but as someone who had simply done what needed to be done. She didn't look back, because some moments don't need reflection, they just need to be lived and remembered. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support means the world to us. It's what drives our team to create more powerful, meaningful stories like the one you just heard. Every like, share, and comment fuels our passion to keep bringing hidden truths to light. Don't forget to hit subscribe and press the bell icon so you never miss the next chapter. We're on a mission at 30 Minds to uncover stories that matter, and your support helps us reach more people who are ready to listen. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. We're truly grateful to have you with us.